Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Nixon. So I will say that this seminar has pretty much is a product of being asked how to start navigating longitudinal data analysis from clients. So a lot of this is quite like anecdotal, and really we're just trying to. My goal today is like trying to highlight as many things as possible that may or may not go wrong in your longitudinal data analysis. Hence the name. So, terminology first. So this is when I get to check if you actually read the abstract. So, when we think about longitudinal data, what do we mean by this? And kind of the one common thing across the many different fields that analyze longitudinal data is the following. We measure subjects repeatedly over time. So that could be your key outcome variable that you're studying. That could be some other variable that's related to that outcome variable that also changes over time. We are following these subjects for some duration. And longitudinal data is not the only word out there for describing this kind of data. So what are some synonyms you can think of? Anyone in the room wants to have a go? Because I can't see chat, so I can't ask chat. Time series, that is a near synonym, but will explain a bit more of that shortly. Any other ones? Okay, so I'll talk about the time series point shortly. The key ones here are repeated measures. So this comes from more of a statistics background, primarily looking at the study design of studies. Right, so we're following probably a key outcome variable over time for a group of subjects. The second one is probably going to throw people a little bit off. Who's heard of panel data before? Okay, that roughly matches the proportion I was expecting. Panel data is another way of looking at longitudinal data. This comes from the field primarily from econometrics, and they kind of look at different like accounting firms or businesses and how their particular variables they're studying evolve over time. And this ties into time series as well. So econometrics, and this is where the time series thing is a near synonym here. Time series implies they're just studying one variable that changes over time. And so what we're looking here when we think about subjects, each subject is its own time series. Right, so that's why I called it a near synonym there in response to the question on the floor. And the last one here is growth curve data, so biological or behavioral sciences. And kind of the key thing here, what they're trying to do is trying to see how a particular physiological trait or kind of psychometric trait evolves over time. And those are 4 different ways of describing what I've got involved in the middle. So some other terminology I want to establish so everyone's on the same page for the seminar, how I'm going to be describing variables. So here when I'm talking about a response variable, we're talking about the variable of interest that we're studying, that we're modeling as a function of time and other covariates. So that's the key thing here. We're allowing our response to evolve or change over time. And what do we mean by covariates here? And here I'm going to take quite a personal definition of covariate in terms of exploring data. It's a variable that we assume that's associated with the response. And this is quite loaded because, as I mentioned earlier, covariates, maybe they change over time as well. So we need some extra definitions there. So the first one is what I'll call a time invariant covariate. This is a covariate that we measure once. And I have seen someone measure time invariant covariate at the end of the study before. Don't do that. The key thing that these variates are usually measured at time 0. So maybe at the start of assigning someone to a treatment arm before initiating their treatment and seeing how the response evolves over time. So some examples of this could be ethnicity, age, your science treatment arm, and so on. The second one, which is kind of the focus of the tail end of this talk, are time-varying covariates. And these are typically covariates that we measure usually at the same time frequency as our response. So for example, we're thinking like some sort of health study, and you're getting people to come in at follow-up to measure a key outcome variable. Maybe you'll also take like a measurement of their blood pressure, for example. And that would change over time, maybe not in the way that it will change the same trajectory as your response, but it might fluctuate around, say, some mean value for that particular subject. So that's the terminology we're working with. Now, when we think about longitudinal data, what does that look like? So when we think about visualizing it, typically your response is numeric in this context, and time is also a numeric variable. So if we think about it from a Stats 101 perspective, our naive visualization would be a scatter plot by default. But what's one thing we're kind of missing the point with this visualization? Recall that longitudinal data, we're following multiple subjects over time. So this particular visualization, we can't figure out like if it's everyone going up, or we can't see how individual traces of a particular longitudinal response by subject varies. So the common visualization you'll see here for any longitudinal data are typically spaghetti plots. I prefer the time series versions of spaghetti plots where you'll also plot the actual data points. And that's just to make sure that you're not trying to extrapolate things between line joins. And you kind of see here, now we've got our spaghetti on the slide. Who can kind of see what the trend looks like at the initial go? Proportional, they're going up or down? Up. So that is what's happening there. So that's good. So what are some ways to help communicate that a bit better? So what people do nowadays is they also superimpose a non-parametric smooth that is a data-informed like mean over time across your longitudinal responses across subjects. And I would typically probably do this with the data points faded out, because the default option you get in ggplot would plot only just the standard error of that mean as a measure of uncertainty. So putting in the same scale as our data is a good idea. And if you don't have many subjects and you want to make sure that, it's most of the participants in your study that are following this general trajectory, you may want to do the longitudinal response by subject as well, which I have seen called post-stamp plots before. Have anyone heard of that term before? Or is it just a term that someone's made in a paper? No, post-stamp plots. Yeah. So there's, because it's like post-stamps apparently. Anyways, you can see how deep in the rabbit hole I got into this talk. And you can kind of see here that most of our responses are following that general trend. Maybe not so much subject 309 and 308 and 332 what's going on there. But you kind of see here that we're trying to, in a sense, dissect our data to get a good idea of what's going on underneath the hood. So you may have noticed I haven't really talked about including a covariate. And if I did that, this talk seminar will be notably longer. So I'll give you some ideas on how to include a covariate into these kind of spaghetti plots. And I'll just do this in the scope of the ggplot2 package. So the first thing is what people will usually do in multiple linear regression, and where we condition our time versus response spaghetti plots on particular values of a covariate, whether it's time invariant or time varying, categorical, or numeric. And you can imagine that would be quite easy for categorical variables, right? You'll just have essentially a stamp for each unique value of your categorical variable. For continuous variables or numeric variables, that will be a bit trickier. So you will need to make use of functions such as cut interval or cut width that comes with the ggplot2 package to discretize your numeric variable before creating the stamp plots. Alternatively, and this might be better suited if you've got time varying covariates, you might want to instead condition on time. This works out nicely if time is discrete, so something that's countable like days like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than time measured within any point between an interval. So that's two ways. The third thing you can make use of, and you can see that there's a lot more you can consider, can make use of color for time invariant covariates, particularly if it's a categorical variable. And the size of the point, if it's a, I think you can make use of this with a time varying or time invariant. You probably get more mileage with a time invariant covariate by using the value of your covariate as to control the size of a point. So those are some strategies. This is not comprehensive, but those are some ideas. Now, because longitudinal data has been called by many different terms, to no surprise, there's actually a lot of methods for longitudinal data analysis. And here I'll try to paint a brief overview of what's like commonly used and just the subtle differences from a bird's eye view top-down approach, and go through some considerations that you would make for model choice. So for longitudinal data analysis methods in general, there's two dominant ones in the field, regardless of whether you come from econometrics, stats, biomedical, and so on. They are generalized linear mixed effect models and generalized estimating equations. Both of them are making extend the linear regression model to model longitudinal responses. The former, in green, a linear mixed effect model, is a general model that can be adapted for longitudinal responses. Whereas our generalizing estimating equations is a methodology that was specifically designed initially to analyze longitudinal data. So what's the difference? And the key thing comes down to the idea of it being subject specific or population averaged. We'll delve a little bit more into that nuance there when we start thinking about influences of model choice. The third most popular model, and I'm probably using the more complex one for my talk here, is a latent growth curve model. So this is a structural equation modeling approach that works perfectly if you've got discrete time. So something countable in order. So like day 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason why latent growth curve models are used is anecdotal reasons from my end why they are quite understandable is because if you're not familiar with structural equation models in general, there are ways of thinking about latent growth curve models as a case of generalized linear mixed effect models. The link I've got here for the reference that you'll get access to at the end goes through why that is the case. And as a result, they're both latent growth curve models and generalized linear mixed effect models are subject specific. Now, what other methods could you use in longitudinal data analysis that are out there? There's actually a lot, and I'll just tell you right now, this is not including some of the ones that are used in econometrics. So you can see there's quite a few. There's about 8 I've listed there. And there's actually a lot more out there. So the key thing here I want to point out is for the more specialized models, say, for example, a marginal structural model, in the use of longitudinal data analysis, you're trying to answer a causal question, and you're trying to balance out your data with weights, for example, to establish a causal effect according to your directed analytical graphs. Generalized method of moments is actually an extension of generalizing estimating equations to account for some nuances of longitudinal data. So my comment here, when you're choosing your method, you do need to refer to your research question and what you're trying to make inferences of from your data. Sometimes you will be able to just use one of these three that I've got on the left-hand side in those boxes. And some of the more specialized methods, or more general, depending who you talk to, might be more appropriate if you're trying to answer a specific question with your longitudinal data. Now, what are some things that would lead you to choose one model over another, though? So the first point that comes to mind is the comparison between subject-specific and population averaged. So in a more technical terminology, these are what we call conditional models versus marginal models. And the idea behind here is that when we interpret, say, a regression coefficient, say, for age, a conditional interpretation for age would be this is the effect of age adjusted for other covariates. And that's a natural interpretation to do if you were to just fit a naive linear regression to non-longitudinal data, right? So we've got that interpretation there for conditional. For population averaged, that gets a little bit more nuanced. So the idea of a population average model is that we're getting an estimate that is purely associated with the covariate of interest. So one way how people try explaining a regression coefficient from a population average model, they would say a unit increase in the mean age corresponds to an increase in, say, the mean longitudinal response. That is one way of doing it. And depending on your particular population average model, that nuance would change a little bit. So for example, for generalizing estimating equations, that effect of age will be averaged across your different time points, for example. So that is the first influence on what detects what model you choose. The second one that probably will catch people off guard a little bit is the idea of discrete time versus continuous time. So here, as I've been describing with my hands, if you've been paying attention to them, is that discrete time is something that's countable. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks. So another thing that's like discretized would be, say, the trajectory of pregnancy. So first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, postpartum. Maybe the ripening stages of bananas, like unripe, ripe, rotten. So we're dealing with that. So all models that I listed there in the previous slide can handle discrete time. But not all of those models can handle continuous time. And what is continuous time then, if we're thinking about it? So one way you can kind of think about it, let's say we're doing a study where we're following a person's treatment trajectory, right? Since baseline, since entering the study. They could turn up at like the first hour since visiting treatment. Oh, okay, let's make that a bit more realistic, like say maybe 1 month after, right? They could come maybe a month and 3 days later after that. Or they can come, say, 2 months after baseline. So kind of what's going on here with continuous time is that you can measure time exactly to the point of when the measurement was made. Another example of this, if you're thinking about, say, a 400-meter sprint. Actually, that's not a good example. What's a good example here? Oh, let's say the completion of a board game, for example, of sequential board games, right? So your first board game may take 34 minutes. So your first measurement's at 34, you measure some variable. The next board game might finish in 10 minutes, right? It's still in order, but there's no kind of discrete bins of when a measurement can occur. It just happens. So that's what we mean by continuous time. So some methods that can handle continuous time, generalized linear mixed effect models that come to mind, extensions of linear regression models for longitudinal data analysis, such as generalized least squares that I mentioned in the slide before would be another approach, but not necessarily, say, a latent growth curve model, because you'll note there the latent growth curve model can only handle discrete time. So do check how you're measuring time in your study to help inform the choice of model. The third big thing that you should consider is time varying covariates. I will tell you right now, I think most methods handle time varying covariates in different ways, right? For example, generalized estimating equations, one of the three common methods there. How they handle it is effectively trying to calculate an average effect of a time varying covariate across time. So one thing that's common across how they deal with time varying covariates is that just about every single model does assume that your time varying covariate is aligned in time with your longitudinal response. So what I mean by that, say you measure someone at follow-up, you also not take like their disease status, but you also measure everything else that could be predictors of disease status at the same moment in time. Most models can't really handle it being slightly off unless you're willing to make a strong assumption. And maybe you could try to handle that with, say, imputation or bringing things forward, but things get a little bit hairy with the interpretation. The only method I know of that can handle time varying covariates and are not time aligned with longitudinal responses are joint models. And the reason for that is because joint models effectively models the time varying covariate by itself and does something magical to try and see how that time varying covariate influences your longitudinal response. So that reference I got there on the previous slide on joint models is a good place to start. The second thing that would inform how you handle your time varying covariate in a model is the idea of exogeneity and endogeneity. Now, I'm probably not an expert in describing this, so this is my very carefully crafted explanation of exogeneity, is that the value of a time varying covariate is only associated with its previous values. What this implies is that whenever you, say, interpret a regression equation, your natural interpretation of that beta coefficient, that regression coefficient, is the correct one. Now, you can slightly violate that a little bit to get that same interpretation, but you're now making more explicit modeling assumptions. So this reference here I got does talk about how far down the line you can get before something is truly endogenous. If you are working with endogenous time varying covariates, I think my research has pointed me to the fact that you may need to use a specialized model or come up with or derive a new model yourself. So try and make sure your time varying covariates are exogenous. And one way of thinking about that is by building directed, can't remember what the A is again. Draw a DAG. Just draw a DAG. And usually exogenous variables are always pointing to the response. Some other things you might want to think about for model choice. Time is a covariate. So you can express time in two different ways. So the first one is categorical time, which is usually always an option for when time is measured in a discrete way. So trimesters or ripening stages of bananas. The nice thing about what people do like categorical time is that we get this nice cross-sectional interpretation of the effect. So we're always comparing like time point 1 against baseline and then time point 2 against baseline. That matches how we would, say, interpret regression coefficients from a two-way ANOVA, for example. And as a result, it is really easy to build interaction terms with other covariates as well. That's probably most of the pros I can think about with cross-sectional time, with categorical time. It's just ease of interpretation. With numeric time or continuous time, you got flexibility now to model the effective time on a longitudinal response. Let's say that as time increases, your longitudinal response increases linearly. You can specify that with just a single regression coefficient. If you saw that it's a curve relationship, you can specify that with a polynomial term or a wiggly line via like a spline, for example. So a nonlinear function. You got all this extra flexibility. And that extra flexibility is nice, especially when your longitudinal response is irregular. And what I mean by irregular here is that maybe some participants might be measured more times than others, or maybe using continuous time, so not everyone's measurement is happening at the same exact instantaneous moment. Right? So that's what makes numeric time quite suitable. One thing just to keep in mind with numeric time, though, is the distance between time points. So this is something I ran into with a contract I'm working with. Our time points were baseline, 1 month, 1 year, and 5 years. Everyone saw that. So if we're modeling as a function as numeric time, is anyone comfortable with making the assumption that, say, we're modeling as a linear change, right? The longitudinal response increases linearly over time. Are people happy with assuming a linear time increase, a change in time over 4 years is still a linear increase? It's probably a really big stretch, right? Because you don't have like the intermediate time points to, formally test if it's still a linear relationship. So yes, numeric time is flexible, but double check where your time points are measured before you trust it completely. Another thing to keep in mind, and this applies to all methods, is the idea of temporal correlation for longitudinal response. And this quote comes from my colleague's slides of talking about temporal correlation in our mixed models short course. That is, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So to kind of conceptualize that, another board game-like example, let's say I just lost a game of Magic the Gathering. So I'm feeling quite frustrated, right? Maybe a few minutes after, I'm still haunted by that loss. That's quite related, right? Because it's quite close in time, but maybe 3 hours later, the frustration has disappeared. So that's kind of one anecdotal way of describing temporal correlation. You want to account for the fact that closer measurements in time are more related than time points further away. And most methods, if not all, account for temporal correlation by modeling the heterogeneity, so the variability of your response by subject. And in fact, some methods actually force you to choose a correlation structure as part of the model specification, such as the generalized estimating equations. Now, One thing I have noticed that does come up as a web hit as of late is this particular blog post by a prominent biostatistician, Frank Harrell, of where they propose that maybe you should just model the lag response as a covariate. So what I mean by lag responses is that your current value of your response depends on the previous value that the immediately previous value you just got. So time 1, so you want to use time 0 as a predictor as well. This kind of idea is actually, I think, comes more from time series than Markov models, from my understanding. But if you're interested in modeling temporal correlation that way, that link I've got there in this slide is a good starting point. But regardless of you using modeling temporal correlation via the heterogeneity of your longitudinal response or this alternative, you should diagnose that whether you got temporal correlation or whether you sufficiently captured it. So two approaches there are autocorrelation plots, which are quite familiar for those of a statistical training background or people who have dealt with time series data before. And the least known one are variograms, which I think are used more commonly in spatial statistics, but they also have applications in temporal and trying to diagnose temporal correlation as well. So that's temporal correlation. Regardless of what method you choose, time invariant covariates, business as usual, you just throw them in your model and you're just making the implicit assumption that the effect of your time invariant covariate is going to be the same across all time points, right? But the one thing you may want to consider for time as a time invariant covariate, which relates to our previous slide a little bit, is whether you should include the longitudinal response at time 0, so say for the start of the study before treatment allocation, as a time invariant covariate. So having a look at this plot here, so I've just done a spaghetti plot of the means for each treatment group. Would you include these points here as part of the longitudinal response or not? And as you think about that, what are some questions you're asking internally? What are we studying? How does this data come about, right? So commonly, when you do include the longitudinal response at time 0 as a time invariant covariate, this is usually going to be informed by your study design. So for example here, which you can see also referencing Frank Harrell here again, the idea here is that in the clinical trial setting, eligibility might be determined by what the variable of interest measured to determine if someone's included in a study or not. So the distribution here, so we only got the means here, so imagine you can see the points. These points here about the means, those spreads might not necessarily be normally distributed, right? Because they might be determined based on study eligibility criteria. So the argument here is that you wouldn't include the longitudinal response at time 0 as part of the response, but rather as a time invariant covariate. Another one that does come to mind, which is a more pointed argument for including it as a time invariant covariate, is when your longitudinal response is a change score, so changes from baseline. And here you can kind of see in this particular plot here, changes from baseline might lose what's happening with the trajectories of each treatment for this particular response variable. So my answer here, do think about this in terms of your study design, if you should include it as a time invariant covariate. And now we're on to probably the main reason why most people are here today. Time invariant covariates, and here I'll be describing the inclusion for modeling a longitudinal response and the generalized linear mixed effect model framework. For those of you who are not familiar with this particular framework, the few key things I need you to understand from it is to help make the tail end of this talk make sense. Think about a linear regression equation. And what we're doing with the linear regression equation is that we're going to assume that that's going to be modeling like the mean of our responses over time. And we're going to deal with the fact that we're measuring multiple people multiple times throughout the study as a random effect term, aka we're clustering our data by subject. So we got a nice regression style interpretation of our covariates, and we're just sweeping up all the subject related dependencies via our random effects. And because generalized linear mixed effect models are a subject specific model, do remember when we took our regression coefficients, it is the effect of, say, age adjusted for all of our other effects, including our other covariates and maybe our random effect structure. So most people, and I think everyone would have tried this, is what happens if you just naively include a time-varying covariate as a fixed effect? So we got our xi, ti here. Now, one thing that comes to mind is that, yes, even though x is also changing, our time-varying covariate is changing over time, your model doesn't actually know that that is the case. And this is actually, it actually ignores the time indexing. So as a result, we misspecified our time-varying covariate as a time invariant covariate. So that's the con of naively including it. Is there any pros to doing this? Well, if you're, say your time-varying covariate is like some sort of elevated distress, for example, this could make sense because when we interpret the regression coefficient for TVC, naively implemented, it's essentially just increasing the response by some amount. So in this case, the weight of pigs increases by 0.21 units. We've increased the feed of the pig by 1 unit. And that effect is constant across time. So maybe if you got like a binary time-varying covariate, the naive implementation could be okay because you're just kind of like blipping up and then back down and then blipping up and then back down. Maybe not so much if your time-varying covariate's numeric, which is where most of the trouble comes from. So one other approach is a time index association style. So here we're kind of leveraging some ideas for how latent growth curve models account for time-varying covariates in a natural way. So what's happening here is that we're going to trick the model effectively to fit a specific beta, a regression coefficient for each distinct time point. And so this pig data we've got here has 10 time points. Is it 10? Or no, I did misremember. It's 11 time points here. So we can get a time-specific association between the effective feed, since that's time varying, on our response. This method tends to work best with discrete time, just like how latent growth curve models only really work with discrete time. And even with 10 here, there's a lot of beta coefficients, so you will need quite a lot of data to try get not only good point estimates, but maybe low standard errors for each of these regression coefficients as well. And you know the code here, how to get a time-specific regression coefficient for the association between our time-varying covariate and response. We do need to trick it to becoming a factor variable, and then we set up an interaction term, but not even an interaction term, just colon time f by feed there to set up the design matrix to do a time index association between our TVC and a longitudinal response. And so when we interpret the regression coefficient, we can say, for this particular time point, this is the association between our TVC and a longitudinal response, adjusted for all other effects. And that logically, to me at least, tracks. Now that might not be satisfactory. So another simple approach would be the idea that we should probably leverage the fact that we are collecting time-varying covariate data over time as well. So this is probably one of the weakest ones I'm presenting here, is model the cumulative effect of the time-varying covariate. And this tends to work best if your time-varying covariate, if you accumulate it for each subject, actually increases. And this is a strategy I think I've seen maybe in survival analysis when you talk about cumulative exposure. So here, as I said, it's one of the weakest ones, but you can say that if every unit increase in the time-varying covariate corresponds to an increase in the longitudinal response, that has the same effect over time. So maybe this cumulative approach, you need to think really carefully if that makes sense for that particular time-varying covariate. Now I'll address the most common approach for handling time-varying covariates in a mixed model framework, and that is decomposing your time-varying covariate into two time-varying covariates, which is quite confusing when you think about it at face value. But what we've got here is what we call a within a between decomposition. So the between decomposition is effectively we're calculating the mean of the time-varying covariate for each subject in our data set. So this captures kind of the regression coefficient here will now capture if the average time-varying covariate increases by 1 unit, what is the expected change in the longitudinal response? And people always accompany this because the mean is only going to capture differences between subjects with the within one. So here we're, in a sense, centering the actual value we observe for a person at a particular point in time by their mean. And this at least accounts for the fact that, the time-varying covariate can, fluctuate over time. In practice, this works best for time-varying covariates that do fluctuate about a value over time. Mileage may vary if that's not the case. So do interrogate your model's regression coefficients if they make sense. So here with our pig example, so the feed is like how much we're feeding these pigs. So we would kind of naturally assume that more we feed them, the heavier they become. And that's kind of your internal check to see if the decomposition approach gives you interpretable regression coefficients that make sense. The neat thing about the between time-varying covariate approach is that it does give you a population averaged effect, and that's because we're now modeling the person means. The within coefficient for BW here, so this value here, that has quite a tedious interpretation. So one way I have this explained to me is that if you feed a pig more than average than you would for that specific pig, what's that effect, right? And that kind of interpretation might not be sensible for your time-varying covariate for your particular study. So that's kind of one of the disadvantages for the decomposition approach, is that the within component may not be interpretable. And those are the four main approaches, and you're probably wondering, surely this is just one way of just doing everything in one go over time variant covariate and a mixed model framework. And I would say there's ideas out there. The one key idea that's out there is the idea of time varying effect models. So this is actually an extension of a particular framework developed in the 1990s that somebody worked out how to apply for longitudinal data analysis. And the kind of idea here, you'll now note that we've got brackets with our beta naught and beta 1. So what we're doing here is that as time increases, those regression coefficients will also change over time, which would then allow us to kind of say how the time variant covariant relationship with the longitudinal response evolves over time as well. Technically, you can fit this as a generalized linear mixed effect model, and that paper there goes through some of the mathematical details how to do it. If you just want to see if it works with your data and you don't want to invest that technical time, there is an R package for it. And kind of thing we get here, if we just do a plot of the coefficient functions, what we do here is essentially for time point 6, the intercept is around 40, and the relationship between the time variant covariant and a longitudinal response is about 0.8-ish, right? So you can now have the regression coefficients change as a function of time. And that could be quite handy. As I said, if you do need a more complicated version of this model that's not supported by the R package, the reference I've got there describes some of the mathematical details and how to implement it by hand. So those are some ideas on how to navigate longitudinal data analysis, particularly for time varying covariates, which is often what I get from clients. And yeah, so here's some of the R code that I ran before to set up all of my plots and stuff, and happy to take any questions. And I'm going to try open up chat as well so I can actually see the questions. Yes. Yep.
These were all for sort of one response. So you were looking at like a really, really, really big series of responses. Do you have any way of like picking out your favorite responses? Like,
so let me see if I've got understood. So we've got a bunch of potential longitudinal responses. So that, and then we're trying to pick the favorite one out of them. The city, okay.
So you've got all the different
species, yeah. Three different, yeah. Okay. You want to identify interesting ones as well with a model. So let me think. So probably what you want to think about there in terms of model searching. So you probably want to think about it as a joint model. So you kind of got like a species, you got the response to say the fire event for each as an individual longitudinal response, and you kind of join it up effectively with black magic, effectively to see how time influences all of those species simultaneously. Yeah, or responses. So kind of think about like a multivariate analysis, and then make use of the joint model machinery to try make sense of that. So that'll be one approach. I do know that some people have looked into using modeling multivariate responses out there as well. I can't think of what's the best term to search, because as you saw in that list of methods, there's a lot of things you can search for longitudinal responses. So I would say a joint model or I want to say a factor analytic model might also do the trick as well, but that might require a bit of adaptation because a factor analytic model as a general purpose model. So yeah, that will be what I will search up for first, see if other people have done it. Yep.
So a lot of this is being reasonably sort of linearly related things, like
yep.
related.
Mm-hmm.
Say you're looking for like a delta response.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's just is there a spike?
Okay.
Something that's not proportional.
So more like a categorical, like a yes, no.
Yeah.
So you can apply most of these approaches for a categorical response as well. There is a how do I want to frame this here? Typically, what I've found with categorical longitudinal responses, you may, and I think this is more of a recent trend, I would say, is to look into Markov models rather than using, say, generalized linear mixed effect model. Again, as I mentioned in the giant model compendium description, do make sure you know what your research question is before deciding between, say, a Markov model or a generalized linear mixed effect model, right? Because a Markov model will give you insights into, how often you stay in a particular category, right? And that could potentially answer your research question in a much better way than a mixed effect model, for example. So Markov models, I would say, see if that helps out, but general linear mixed models, generalized estimating equations can be used for categorical responses as well. Sweet. Yep.
Talking about the between and within
Decomposition. Yeah.
Approach. You mentioned that the within term may not really be interpretable. Does that also mean that you shouldn't interpret the between, or can you interpret that and just sort of consider the within coefficient sort of a
nuisance?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Can you repeat that?
okay. So the question is, for the decomposition approach for a time varying covariate, the within coefficient sometimes may not be interpretable in the context of your data. Can we treat that as a nuisance problem? So, I honestly don't know of many papers where I can't think of, like, in my deep rabbit hole dive of when people do ignore it, but I think most people will be okay with just interpreting the between effect, because effectively this is really similar to how a generalized estimating equation will handle a time varying covariate, right? So I would say that's definitely going to be interpretable with the within time varying covariate. You would want to include a within one though, because that is capturing the trajectory of how the time varying covariate changes. And yeah, I don't have a good answer of can you definitely ignore or not, is my thing. But I would say you would treat it like a nuisance parameter in that case.
Yeah, well, I guess it's coming down to if you figure out that the within one is not meaningful for your data and research design, should you choose a different approach?
So would you choose a different approach? So I don't know how to answer that, but I would say that I have seen people just include the mean time varying covariate as an effect before. The nuance there is that you're kind of making the assumption that your time varying covariate is just fluctuating about like a common value, right? So yeah. Yep.
I'm thinking about this as if including the between effect makes sense, and maybe that's what you're interested in. Then including the within effect allows you to model sort of the departure from that. So it gets captured by the model, but you might not care about it, and then you just ignore it, and that seems fine.
That's fine. Yeah, I don't have a problem. I was just wondering. Yeah,
If
but,
they-
yeah, like what the common advice would, because they do sort of go together. And if one of them really doesn't make sense, does the other one still make sense? Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe it's not that the within doesn't really make sense. I mean, it represents something.
Yeah.
That's actually happening, I guess. It's just difficult to interpret. Which seems fine if you don't care about that aspect of the data, right?
It is like the intercept when the intercept makes no sense. I don't know, like, it may be
Right,
right,
yeah.
but sometimes intercept that
Yep.
zero makes no sense for interpretation,
Yep.
but you have to include it.
Yeah.
In your
I
mark,
just think-
so there might be something
It's a bit more like a random effect.
like that.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
random, that, and then even if it's not important, if you include it, it won't change that
Yeah.
much, right? So then
You might
including
do
it better.
You might do the mixed model because you want the random effect to take to account for that structure,
That's right.
But you know,
but you don't actually care about it.
You
so
don't
then- then what the effect-
And if it's not that important, it won't affect your, when you fix it like that, so then.
So just to summarize, if the microphone didn't capture it, the conversation on the floor eventually boiled down to you'll still fit it anyway because it is capturing the trajectory of how the time variant covariate's changing. But it's not, it's kind of like how we have to always fit an intercept in the linear model. We fit it because we have to, and we don't necessarily interpret it. I'll just double check